and I'm very, very happy to have with us two people, one over the web and one physically present. So I'm going to start with Kelvin, who is he's online, Kelvin Chan. It's great to have him present for us. Kelvin is a man of many hats, and he's probably the man that has more hats that I've seen anyone else wearing. But he's an oncologist at Sunnybrook, and a medical oncologist staff at Sunnybrook. He's the co-director of ARC, which is the Applied Research in Cancer Control in Collaborative. I don't know exactly what the institute, maybe, I don't know. But also he's a clinical lead at CCO, and he has a number of grants that on his research time works on in a topic a little different than the one that's going to be presented today, around the real world evaluation of technologies around their value for money and their cost effectiveness in oncology, in which I'm happy to be a part of a series of grants with him. And Eleanor, on the other side, is a biostatistician and a senior scientist at CKIDS. And I think the link between... Sorry?
Co-director.
Co-director of ARC, Kelvin. Yes, that's correct, yes. And so Eleanor Pullenayegum, and I think the link with Kelvin, among others, is the PhD of Kelvin was done with Eleanor, and I think part of the discussion of today is around the PhD thesis of Kelvin, if I understand correctly. So very happy to have them both here. And maybe before we start, questions, given the complexity of the webinar, questions during, after, what do you guys think?
I'm happy to take questions during. If it's getting funky with the, especially with Kelvin answering questions, then we may
defer them to the end. Okay. Okay, cool. So thank you very much again. Floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for having us. So we wanted to cover, thank you. Measurement of health utility. So we'll talk briefly about how it's measured, why it's important. And then the main topic that is going to revolve around is how you quantify uncertainties in these measures, specifically probabilistic uncertainties. And then Kelvin will speak to how master imputation can account for that in your analysis. This is probably redundant for this audience, but we want to explain why they're important, alongside underestimates of utility, and what to do about it. So, as you probably know, obviously it's used to decide which treatments should be publicly reimbursed. So, CADIS, when there's a new drug on the market, there'll be an economic evaluation done, and for all the provinces except Quebec, CADIS would make recommendations around whether or not that should be reimbursed. Those recommendations, their advice is that when you trade off the cost and effectiveness, that the measure of effectiveness should, if possible, be the quality-adjusted life year. And the idea with the quality-adjusted life year is capturing both length of life and quality of life. So we don't just want to have people living really long and being in debilitating states. We want to capture the quality of the life as well. So if you think about plotting quality of life over time, the quality-adjusted life year is just the area under that curve. And that's important because if you think about what you're doing there, you're going to need quality of life to have some very specific properties. You're going to want living for 2 years with a quality of life of a half to be worth the same amount as living for 1 year with a quality of life of 1. Those things, the quality-adjusted life years would both be 1, right? So you need your quality-adjusted life, you need your measure of quality of life to have interval measurement properties. So you can't just take like a regular quality of life scale, count up the responses, and call that a quality of life. You use that to calculate your quality of life. That won't work. So we use these things called health utilities, where 0 is a state equivalent to death, and 1 is a state equivalent, is full health. And in between, it has interval measurement properties, which means we have to be pretty careful about how we measure it. So this is important because one of the ways we summarize the evidence is incremental cost effectiveness ratio, so the ratio of incremental cost to incremental effectiveness, in this case, incremental quality. So you get your estimate of the ISO, that's lovely. But precision of it matters, because these two scenarios represent what might result in quite different recommendations. So if your ISO is $40,000 per quali, but then you report a confidence interval that goes from 5,000 to 300,000, the comment then might be, well, that's just too uncertain. Maybe we should do some more research before making a recommendation. Whereas if we report $40,000 with a confidence interval of 35,000 to 50,000, it might then come to the conclusion that it is at least cost effective. So precision matters. How do you measure these things? You can use a direct approach or an indirect approach. Some examples of direct approaches are time trade-off, standard gamble, and new kid on the block is a discrete choice experiment. And indirect approaches, which is what we're going to spend most of the time talking about, these are multi-attribute utility instruments, which sound really scary. Basically, it means it's just a questionnaire, which people fill out. So this is an example of a time trade-off task. The respondent would be presented with a health state. In this case, I've got some pain, some trouble walking about, and otherwise no problems. And you would be asked, would you prefer this state for 10 years followed by death, or 8 years in full health? For example, that might be your second point. And if you say, I prefer 8 years in full health, but then say, well, what about if it was 7 years in full health? And we keep taking that down until such a point as you say, I'm indifferent. And similarly, if initially you said, I prefer 10 years in full health, we'd say, well, what if it was 10 years in the impaired health state? We then say, well, what if it was 9 years in full health? And we keep inching that up until you say, I'm indifferent. And then because, get my pointer here. Okay, I've lost it. Because we're assuming that we've got equivalence, we want to estimate the utility of this state here at the top. The utility of this times 10 is then equal at the indifference point to full health times the number of years at the indifference point. So you can back solve for the utility. A standard gamble, various versions, but this is one version. The respondent we presented with, would you prefer to live with for 10 years with some pain, some trouble walking, and otherwise no health problems, and then die? Or would you prefer to take a gamble in which there's a 10% probability that you live with full health for 10 years, and that, sorry, a 10% probability that you die immediately, and a 90% probability that you live for full health in 10 years and then die? Would you prefer this one with certainty, or will you take the gamble? If you choose to take the gamble, then we just increase your probability of immediate death until such a point as you say, I'm indifferent. Similarly, if you choose to take this one, we then decrease your probability of death until you say you're indifferent. And then similarly, you can back solve to find the utility, because we know that the utility of this state here, when it's 0 times your probability at indifference point times 1 minus the probability at the indifference point times 10 times 1, I beg your pardon, and then you can solve for the utility. So as you might imagine, you need a trained interviewer to do these things. They're conceptually pretty demanding. And so it may not be feasible to do them. Moreover, it might not be ethical. If you're working with patients with severe depression, you just can't give them these tasks. So that's why indirect measurement becomes appealing. The way indirect measures work is you give the respondent a standardized questionnaire that enables you to classify the person's health into a health state, and there's a predefined algorithm that assigns utility to those health states. What's nice about this, so this is an example, this is a CEQ5D, it's an example of a multi-attribute utility instrument, which is a mouthful. So simple one-page questionnaire, 5 dimensions: mobility, self-care, pain, discomfort, anxiety, depression. For each of those, you have 1 of 3 responses: no problems, some problems, extreme problems. So it's super simple. It can be done by the patient when we're in the waiting room. It can be done at home. It can be done over the phone. It can be done all sorts of different ways. So how do you get utilities out of these things? So this instrument, I just showed you, it captures a total of 243 health states. And we need to assign utilities to them. And so this is done through a one-off valuation study. Usually do the valuation study once in each country. So members of the general public are given TTO or data gamble tasks. Usually people can do, if it's TTO, probably around 10 tasks each. And so they give their utilities for each health state. So at the end of the day, you have a bunch of health states, a bunch of utilities, and we're going to need to make some predictions about mean utilities for each of those health states, which is usually done through some sort of regression modeling. In this case, I've got my TTO response, it's person I, value state J, and I'm going to regress that onto attributes of the health state. So here with EQ5D, this is what the US study did. We've just got a bunch of dummy variables describing the health state. So the dummy variable for was ability at level 2 versus 1, the dummy variable for 3 versus 1, and similarly for all 5 attributes. You run the regression model on your data, and this is the regression coefficients that they got out. So the way this works is now if you have a health state, so this is a health state that's saying, I have no problems in mobility, I have some problems in self-care, I have extreme problems with usual activities, some problems with pain and discomfort, and no problems with anxiety and depression. So it's one of the health states. The way you score that is then you go through here and you say, well, mobility was at level 1, so I don't pick up either of these. Self-care was at level 2, so I pick up this coefficient here. Usual activities was at level 3, so I pick up this one. Pain and discomfort was at level 2, so I pick up this one. And then these are some sort of interaction terms. So this is the number of dimensions that have moved away from from full healthy on the first. So I have 2 of those. And this is the number of dimensions at level 2 beyond the first squared. I have 1 of those. And so that's the calculation that would then give you the utility. So what's the issue with all of this? The issue is that whenever you're making predictions, those predictions are subject to uncertainty. And typically what's being done is that we're just completely ignoring that uncertainty, which is a problem. So what I'd like to do in the next 10 or so minutes is to look at first of all, how large is that uncertainty? And secondly, what's the impact on estimates of things like mean utility and incremental mean utility? So what's the issue here is that we're doing this predictive model. So the mean utility for health state J, this is my UJ, this is the thing that I want to estimate. And I've got this linear model. There's 2 sources of certainly probabilistic uncertainty here. One is that we're uncertain about the slope of the line. And the second is that the points don't lie exactly on the line. So what had happened in the past is that people have been thinking about the first source of uncertainty, but not the second. It turns out that the first sort of uncertainty, there's actually very little of that, and so people thought it didn't matter. But when you factor in the second source of uncertainty, things blow up on you. So this was the US valuation study, 3,500 odd. This was a 3-level valuation study, so 3,500 respondents, each valued 10 health states. A total of 42 of the 243 health states were valued, and predictions were made about all of them. And so what I've done here is I'm saying, let's suppose that this assumption that the model perfectly fits the data is correct. Let's suppose that's true. If that were the case, how large would my mean squared errors on cross-validation be? So if I take the observed mean utility from the data and I compare that to the predicted, what's my mean squared error? So I've done that, assuming no model misfit, with the thinking that if my observed mean squared errors are much larger than what we see, what theoretically they should be, then I know that model misfit is a problem. And then, given that this turns out to be an issue, use the Bayesian analysis to reveal predictive distributions of the mean utility, so we can really get a handle on how certain are we. So omit each health state in turn. On the remaining health states, fit the regression model, get the predicted values for the omitted health state, compare predicted versus observed. So if the standard model is correct, the expected mean squared error, there's some nice little formula here, but what you need to know is that the variance of the sample mean TTO. So this is basically sampling error in the observed mean. There's a variance due to uncertainty in regression coefficient, so the slope of that line. And then there's a covariance term which ends up just being tiny. So if you like math, what's happened here is I've got my observed mean and this is my predicted mean. I've subtracted off the true mean and added it back in and then expanded the square. So this is what happens. Basically, the mean square errors are way larger than they should be. So this first term, that's the sampling variance in the observed mean. The second term is the uncertainty in regression coefficient. And the covariance term, as I said, is tiny. So if you add those together, your observed mean squared error is 0.00029. What you observe is something about 5-fold larger than that. Now, you may be thinking these numbers are tiny, what gives, right? But so remember that utilities exist on a 0 to 1 scale. And to convert back to the original scale, you have to sort of take a square root of this. And I meant to do that before I came, and I forgot. But I think it's about probably by 0.04-ish. Not yet. So it starts to matter. So we then fitted a Bayesian model which accounted for the extent of model misfit. So again, if you happen to be someone who likes equations, your standard model is this without the delta. So it's just a regression model. We've got some random effects to account for with this subject correlation. And then we said, well, we don't actually believe that it's a perfect fit to the data, so we're going to add in a model misspecification term. If you're a Bayesian, you can think of that as a model misfit term, and you're going to put a Gaussian pi on that. If you are a frequentist, you can think of it as a state-level random effect. When you do that, what I've plotted here is for each health state, I've plotted the predicted mean utility, that's the black dot, the confidence intervals assuming no model misfit. The gray lines are the confidence intervals accounting for model misfit, and the X's are the observed mean. And so a couple of things I want to highlight. About I think something like 60% of the X's don't lie within the confidence interval assuming no model misfit. So the coverage probability, if you ignore model misfit, is terrible. Second thing I want to point out is that when you account for model misfit, your confidence intervals become much larger. In fact, the width of the confidence interval is about 0.15 on average. It ranges from 0.14 to 1.7. And the reported minimum important differences for the EQ5P, they range widely, but usually about 0.03 to 0.08. In other words, these things are so wide that they're wider than the MIT. Doesn't matter. I hope I've
I think Petra's might run
I'm just going to stop talking. Thank you so much. That's never happened. We're now going to look at what's the impact on estimates for population mean utility and incremental and quality of this uncertainty. So when you think population mean utility, now it gets confusing because you've got two studies. You've got the valuation study, and that's a fixed. And then that valuation study is going to be used every time you do a clinical study or a population study that uses EQ5P, you're going to draw on information from that valuation study. So that means when you've got this population study and your target of inference is a mean utility, you've got a couple of sources of uncertainty. Well, you have many, many sources of uncertainty, but we're going to think about two of them. One is sampling variation in the population study, and the other is uncertainty in the scoring algorithm. And we're going to look at how those change as the size of your population study changes. But as you may know, so this is a plot of the variation due to sampling error in the population study. Oopsie. That's this line that goes down, and this is the contribution to the total variance due to error in the valuation study. And as you can see, the sampling error in the population study, it goes down like y over square root of n, which we would expect it to do. And this one stays the same, which means that once you're, in this particular example, once your sample size gets to about 375, the sampling error in the valuation study starts to dominate sampling error in the population study. So unfortunately, you can never get accuracy that's better than about 0.0085, I guess, in your estimated mean utility, no matter how large your population study, because the error in the valuation study stays the same. So that's kind of sad. We now think about incremental mean utility. Here I simulated data from an RCT, simulating a pair of health state distributions. Use each of those distributions to simulate subject level health states. You then use that scoring algorithm to get the utilities, take the mean utility per arm, calculate the difference. That's your simulated incremental mean utility. And what I've done here is I've plotted type 2 error, so 1 minus the power, versus the size of the difference to be detected. So various sample sizes, so 100 to 500. The dotted lines are what happens if you use the correct variance estimate that accounts for uncertainty in the scoring algorithm, and the solid lines are if you use what's currently done, which is if you ignore it. So you can see the differences in power are substantial. The very faint line at the bottom is the limiting case where you actually have infinitely large RCTs. And sadly, this is kind of the smallest MID that's out there. Your power never gets better than about 0.83. 0.83? No, that's 0.77 or something like that. You never get more than 77% power, no matter how large your sample size. What I've done here is I've plotted essentially the Z statistic versus the size, the MID that we're after for each of the simulated data sets. And this is simulation under an infinitely large sample size. So you can have an infinitely large randomized control trial, and we would achieve significance if my Z-score was larger than 1.96. And what I've done, so I've drawn a horizontal line here, and then I've said, what's the smallest difference in the utility for which I could be guaranteed that the Z-score is larger than 1.96, and it's about 0.1. So even with an infinitely large RCT, the only MID you can be sort of guaranteed to detect is 0.1 or larger. And the reported MIDs are rather smaller than that. So I hope I've convinced you that the uncertainty in the scoring algorithm is substantial and should be accounted for. And before I turn it over to Kelvin, who's going to talk about how do we account for this, I just want to mention this is not unique to the EQ5D. For example, the SF60, their standard errors on their utility is about 0.06, which would translate into confidence intervals, which were about 4 times that, so 0.24, which is again way larger than the MID. So over to Kelvin.
Thanks, Eleanor. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. First of all, thank you for THETA, and thank you, Petros, for inviting Eleanor and me to give this THETA round. And also thank you for everyone for joining. So Eleanor, right now we are on slide 40, 40, right? Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. So I'll be focusing on hopefully coming up with some suggestions of how to account for that uncertainty. And so the 2 things is that I want to emphasize is we'll be focusing on a kind of get around way using a technique that's well known in other areas in statistics related to multiple imputation. And the other issue I want to highlight is that there may be other ways to account for the uncertainty, but the reason why we chose multiple imputation is because of its practicality, in the sense that most statistical softwares already have multiple imputation to allow for multiple different types of analysis to be used. So assuming that the technique works, then it can be adapted using different statistical software, and that's one of the motivations why we think that this is a reasonable approach. So as Eleanor has mentioned, the current problem is that we have been using multi-attribute utility instruments. EQ5 is one of them, but as Eleanor mentioned, it applies to all the multi-attribute utility instruments, in the sense that when we look up the health state, we have a value set, and we see a single value. But beyond that, we actually don't get a sense of the uncertainty around that value. And when Eleanor mentioned about the US EQ5D study, they directly measure 42 health states from the population. So it's not that we don't have information about the direct utility from those 42 health states, but when we apply the current value set, the value set that we have for those 42 health states are not from the directly measured value. It's actually from the predictive value from the algorithm. And again, the algorithm assuming no misspecification. So this is one of the challenges that we're facing. And so with by ignoring the uncertainty altogether, the cost utility analysis coming out from the use of multi-attribute utility instruments may not capture the full extent of the uncertainty, and so the uncertainty in the qualities may also be underestimated. So, next slide, please. Right, so one possible solution is actually to adopt a Bayesian approach. So similar to what Eleanor has already done, if people have the original full data set from the valuation study, as far as I know, US is the only one who has publicly make available the full data set for EQ5D, and I think most of the valuation studies, they don't make the full data set available for all researchers publicly. But assuming that you have access to the full data set, and if you have your own research question and your own data set, you put them together and perform a full Bayesian analysis, specify your likelihood, make some assumptions about your vague priors, and then put in the term for the model misspecifications, delta J here, then I suppose that's one solution. But you can see the challenge that we're facing if that's not available. And also that assumes that we all have to learn to become Bayesian. And I think we have to face the fact that not everyone will be trained as a Bayesian. And so it may be a challenge for people who are in this field interested in health utilities and qualities, but they actually are not equipped from a Bayesian perspective. So next slide. So just a quick summary about what Bayesian analysis is. I think most people in the room probably know what it is, but just to summarize that, generally for any Bayesian analysis, we first assume a prior distribution. So, and that sometimes can be a vague prior, but if we have prior knowledge, we can give more information or precision for that prior. And then we have the data, which informs the likelihood. And it's the combination of the prior and the likelihood that will help us generate the posterior distribution, which is where we want to get to. Historically, not a lot of people have been doing Bayesian analysis just because it's hard to find closed form solution for Bayesian analysis, with a few exceptions. But these days, with the advances with the computational power and a lot of different algorithms have come up, people may have heard of softwares like Winbugs. It's increasingly easy to actually perform Bayesian analysis without having to resort to a closed form solution, and it can be quite flexible for a lot of problems. So next slide. So as I mentioned, if we can certainly use Bayesian analysis to solve the uncertainty issue, but we need to have raw data from the valuation study. And if we don't have it, then we need the original people who actually collected the data to actually use the full Bayesian analysis. So basically, they have to do all the analysis themselves and give us the results. Next slide. So now a little bit of a brief introduction about multiple imputation. It's used in a way to help people estimate in an unbiased way the correct estimate as well as the uncertainty around it in data sets where they are missing data. And generally, we think about missing data based on that the taxonomy put forward by Rubin, who originally developed multiple imputation. We can think about that as completely missing completely at random, missing at random, or not missing at random. So in cases where it is at least missing at random, we can consider multiple imputation as a way to come up with unbiased estimates despite the missing data. And also it will capture the correct degree of uncertainty. And that's the feature that we are hoping to use from multiple imputation. So generally there are 3 steps. The first step is to fill out the missing data. There are different methods to do that. But fill out the missing data m times. So essentially you start off with one data set with missing data, but you ended up with m data sets with completed imputed data. And once you have the m completed data sets, you actually perform your analysis, whatever analysis you're trying to do on the data set, separately, individually on each of the m data sets. So you basically have m sets of results from the m sets of completed data sets. And then once you have that, then you combine those results using what's called Rubin's rule to get at the correct unbiased estimate and the proper uncertainty. So next step. Right, so this is just a graphical way of illustrating that. You started off the first step with an incomplete data set. Next. Right, and then you impute. In this case, we're imputing 3 sets, but depending on scenario, people may have different desire to choose how many imputed sets they should choose. So in this case, you have now, based on imputation of using different methods, come up with 3 completed sets. Next slide. And then you perform separate analysis for those 3 different sets. So you have 3 sets of results. And then the last step is you pull those results using what's called Rubin's rule, and that give you the unbiased estimate and the correct uncertainty. So next slide. So the idea here is that we can probably use multiple imputation as a way to approximate Bayesian analysis. And that would be a way to handle missing data. So in that case, we can probably think about the delta J, the model misspecification term, almost like a missing data. And so by doing that, then hopefully we'll be able to impute the correct amount of uncertainty. So next slide. Now, thinking about the data set up here, I'm using EQ5D3 level as an illustration. Again, there's no reason why it cannot apply to EQ5D5 level. There's no reason why it cannot apply to main effects model versus N3 model versus E1 model, for example. And there's also no reason why it cannot apply to maybe other multi-attribute utility measures. So in this particular case, EQ5D3L has 243 health states. As you can tell. So next slide. Keeping that in mind, basically by doing a Bayesian analysis, you can generate a posterior distribution for the joint distribution of the 243 health states. And so you can see that once you have that posterior joint distribution, here I put down state 2, state 3, state 4, all the way to state 243. And they all look a little bit different, obviously, because each health state has a different mean and different distribution. Next slide. Right. So what we can then do here is that based on the Gibbs sampler from the posterior distribution, we can then randomly select 100 points from which of the distribution. So we can see that the first imputed set here is that it contains, again, the full 243 health state. The first health state obviously is 1, utility of 1. But we basically select a point from each of the 243 posterior distributions. So that come up with an imputed complete set, but it's an imputed set of health states that contains all 243 health states. So next slide. So now we go on to doing the second imputation. Again, one draw from each of the health state posterior distribution. So that gives us a second imputed data set. And then the third one, and then so on and so forth. And we can decide how many we want, but in this case, we picked 100 imputed sets for illustration. So right now we have 100 imputed states. Each data set actually have 243 health states. And then we can use that then to aid with our analysis. So next slide. So imagine that the researcher has a data set, pretend that it's only a data set with 5 health subjects, and each of the health subjects has a health state. So this is where the researchers will be starting the analysis. Before this slide, what we were discussing in the previous slide would be where the developer of the MAUI, the person who actually has the original data set, will have to do to create those 100 data sets to make it available. But once that is done, then their job is done. And then everything after that will be up to the researcher who wants to do the analysis using their own data set. So in this case, 5 subjects, each of them has a different health state. Next slide. So remember that we have 5 imputed data, we have 100 imputed data sets. And from those 100 imputed data sets, we can look up and see what's the utility for each of these 5 subjects. So if we look up the first imputed data set, we look up the specific health state 3, 11, 125, 200, and 243 for set number 1. So then that will give us the first set of the utilities. And then we look up set number 2. Again, look at the health state 3, 11, 125, 200, and 243. It gives us the second set for our patients. And then if we keep doing that for all 100 data sets, then next slide. Then we will have basically we have 100 different data sets. Each one of them will have 5 subjects with their 5 health utilities. They will be all slightly different, but then you can perform your analysis pretending that all we're interested in is just the mean and the variance. Then you just do your usual standard analysis of mean and variance calculation. Then you'll come up with 100 different means and variances. And next slide. Then by using the Rubin's rule, you can then combine all 100 data sets so that you'll have the overall estimate, hopefully unbiased estimate of mean, as well as hopefully the properly accounted for variance. So next slide. So this is the method that we are proposing to help account for the underestimation variances. And so we want to validate to see whether this method properly accounts for the underestimation of variances. So the study aim moving on from this point is to use US EQ5D3L as the data set that we want to explore and want to demonstrate that multiple imputation can correct the underestimation variance. Next slide. So the derivation, as we said, is the EQ5D3L as our platform. We do need another external data set, and the one that we've chosen is the Commonwealth Fund Survey data set for sick adults. And so that's a separate, completely separate data set, which we have values for close to 4,000 patients. So first, what we did was using the derivation data set, we applied the D1 model and fit the Bayesian mixed effect model, just like what Eleanor has been describing before. We obtained a posterior predictive distribution to come up with the to try to estimate what the actual mean utility is and apply to the application set. Okay, next slide. So here's the formula that Eleanor has shown before. Again, just to help us remember, MAUJ is the mean utility for health state J, and XJ beta here is really this utility based on the health state patients in. So XJ is sometimes known as the design matrix, but it's essentially telling us what health state they are in. And then the beta is just the beta coefficient that we estimate from any regression, any regression. And again, beta also is subjected to some uncertainty because we also, when we estimate beta, we always have some constant interval around there. And the delta J here is the deviation of the predicted health utility from the true utility. So that's the first step. And you can see that when we think about the variance of MAUJ, the variance obviously comes from multiple sources, but including potential variances from the beta, but also uncertainty from delta J as well. So after we have all that set up, then we use the joint predictive distribution then to implement multiple imputation. So next slide. So one of the things that we do first was to try to make sure that the 95% confidence interval coverage of health utilities actually is as expected based on the multiple imputation method. So without going into too much details about this piece, essentially what we did was using the raw data to estimate the mean and the variance covariance matrix of the directly measured 42 health states from the valuation study from US, and using that to create simulation data sets. And with the simulation data set, then, knowing the truth from the raw data and with the simulated data set, we can then try to figure out different methods and how the 95% confidence interval coverage performs. So the first column here in this table is that if we ignore delta J, the model misspecification, and if we pretend that at least we care about the confidence interval around the beta coefficient, which is, by the way, we don't even sometimes do that in routine practice, but pretend that if we were to do that, then we're seeing that only about 40% of the simulation performed adequately in terms of coverage. However, if we actually use multiple imputation, the methods that we're proposing right now, we see that the probability coverage is actually quite good. It's at least as good as 95% and maybe a slight trend towards over coverage. Next slide, please. We then move on to compare 3 different methods and see whether we are getting the right uncertainty and the right estimates. So if you look at the derivation data set, again, this is from US EQ5D3L and fitting a Bayesian mixed effect model, a D1 model as per US study. And next slide. So here is the coefficient. If we are looking at the coefficient only in terms of looking at variances based on the D1 model, we can calculate the mean and the variances by the covariance. Next. We can also directly look at the posterior distribution of the health states by the full Bayesian analysis. So that will give us the mean and the variances based on the posterior predictive distribution. And finally, next, we then use Monte Carlo Markov chain method based on the random draw from the posterior predictive distribution, and then apply the methods of multiple imputation to come up with different imputed sets, and then use the Rubin's rule to combine them, and that will give us the mean and variance by imputation. So we have 3 different methods to try to apply to the application set, the Commonwealth Survey Fund, to find the overall mean and variances. So the objective here is that comparing to those 3 methods, knowing that the Bayesian method is supposed to be, quote unquote, the gold standard that we're aiming for, what's the current method, meaning that using the coefficients of the D1 model, how does it perform when we compare with the new method that we're proposing, which is the multiple imputation method. Next slide. So this is the summary result. And as you can see, the last column, the full Bayesian model, is the quote-unquote gold standard here. And the first column here is the traditional method based on the beta coefficient, ignoring the model misspecification. And the middle one is the multiple imputation method. So all 3 methods, from a mean estimation perspective, all 3 methods seem to provide a relatively unbiased estimation of the mean when we apply to the Commonwealth Fund survey data. But when we look at the variances, I think you can see some obvious difference here. Next. So if you look at the traditional method, if we just look at the beta coefficient variances, the standard error estimated here is 2.82 times 10 to the power minus 3, which is substantially less than the full Bayesian model. Next. Which is 1.12 times 10 to the power minus 2. You can see it's not just a trivial difference. We're talking about close to a 25, like almost like only a 25 to 30% of the original standard error. And when you look at multiple imputation, the standard error is almost identical with those from full Bayesian model. Next slide. So here again, we are trying to explore how many imputed data set we need when we implement multiple imputation to try to get to the right coverage. So on the right-hand side, again, is the full Bayesian model, which is what we believe to be the proper degree of uncertainty. On the left is the degree of uncertainty that we will get if we only use the beta coefficient and the constant interval around it to construct our estimate. And you can see again graphically that there's quite a bit of underestimation. And in between, you can see that there are different numbers of imputed data set that we're using to try to explore whether we can get to the right coverage. So next. And the next one. Right. So empirically, it seems like by the time when we get to about 20 data sets, which is computationally fairly easy for our modern day computer to manage, we seem to be able to actually get to pretty decent coverage here. Next slide. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, hi.
Are we still here? Oh, okay. Should I hold?
Code Red, Peter Musk Building, ground floor, Park South, PP2 Drive, FS303. Code Red, Peter Musk Building, ground floor, Park South, PP2 Drive, FS303. Code Red, Peter Musk Building, ground floor, Park South, PP2 Drive, FS303.
All right.
That's code. Okay, that's code red. Are you sure you don't need to evacuate?
Not an hour away.
Okay, I will try to finish early in case you want to run off. Okay, so I think we are now at discussion. What we believe is that this method, multiple imputation, will provide a middle ground in the sense that researchers do not need to learn Bayesian methods. And the variance in the standard error will still reflect the appropriate degree of parameter uncertainty, which is important for our estimation, especially when we think about cost utility analysis. Especially more recently, CASAS is adopting the probability analysis as the base case, so proper estimation and proper accounting of the degree of parameter uncertainty is important. And also the applicability hopefully will be wide, just because multiple imputation, it's a technique that has been widely used for decades, and all standard software, statistical software, will have it available. Next slide. Potential limitation. So understandably, people will still need to generate those imputed data sets. So the original publisher, the people who actually own the MAUI or raw data, will actually need to implement the at least first step, which is to create the first Bayesian mixed model and generate those imputed data sets from the posterior distribution and make it publicly available to allow for this method to be implementable for researchers. So next slide. Yeah, so I guess this is our conclusion slide. We feel that multiple imputation is a potential method to account for underestimation of variances of predicted health utilities, and with the increasing emphasis of accounting for parameter uncertainty for cost utility analysis, we feel that this is something that's worth paying attention to and exploring further. Next slide. In terms of some of the ongoing work and future directions, there are different ways of potentially improving precision. Now that we talked about that there's an underestimation of uncertainty, meaning that some of the studies that was done previously that we thought was statistically significant, for example, it may only be statistically significant based on false precision. That because it wasn't correcting for the proper degree of uncertainty. And so people may not like the fact that we are suggesting that the uncertainty should be properly accounted for, because it's harder to get to a statistical p-value of 0.05 for publications. But I think some of the work that will that hopefully will that we'll be able to look at in the future, and I think Eleanor and her team is actively looking into some of these, is that there are different ways to improve precision. So hopefully that would actually lead to, again, a better precision and maybe a less degree of uncertainty. using different posterior distribution. For delta, currently we're using a multivariate normal distribution, but there may be other distribution that's more suitable and improve precision. We may have to look at model correlation among the deltas, and also that there's always debate in the literature about the original valuation data set. What's the right design for those valuation studies? And in the U.S. study, obviously they directly evaluate 42 states, but there are many different designs out there from different countries, and some countries oversample and may even come up with almost like a saturated model. And so certainly more research, more discussion about what's a properly designed study for valuation, country-specific valuation study will be useful. Especially in light of thinking about uncertainty, capturing uncertainty, and perhaps quantifying mean square error as a way to think about what's the right sample size for these valuation study. So with that, I think the next slide is really the last slide now, I think. So I would definitely want to acknowledge and thank Eleanor for putting up with me over the years of lots of silly questions about math and stats, but I do hope that she will continue to put up with me with more questions in the future with other silly questions. And also I would like to thank other committee members on my PhD thesis committee as well for their contribution and their support. So with that, I think I will pause for now and see if there's any questions.
I think we have 10 minutes or so for questions. So. The questions are at the end. Do I ask Sky or do I ask Eleanor beside me? But so the main source of the error here is the model misspecification. I understand correctly. So I mean, one thing that Kelvin just said is, if they'd evaluated more states or had a saturated model that could have been no model misspecification, then you'd be left with more, I guess, uncertainty around each helm state itself. So, I mean, you have the original data. Did you try to fit a model that just fits better? You duplicate the model from the original valuation in your regression. I suppose if you added more terms, more interactions, so you could have gotten closer to the observed values, but then there'd be more error in their coefficients.
Right? That's correct. So you only get so far adding more coefficients. What show is that sitting back there, she's done really nice work of actually estimating the model misspecification sums, and you put a spatial correlation structure on them, and I think you showed a 25% reduction in squared error when you do that. So yeah, there's more. You can get more precise.
No.
So without having the original data from the valuation, is there any type of rule of thumb on uncertainty that you can suggest or recommend? Like a certain maybe value that when we're actually calculating our cost effectiveness?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a tough one because some health states have much more uncertainty than others, and so it's specifically the more severe health states, I think, where the standard errors are larger. So the size of the error is going to be dependent on how sick your population is. So I don't, unfortunately, so as an extreme example, if everyone's in full health, then there's just no error because everyone has the alternative one. But I mean, it's a helpful suggestion that maybe we could think about there are some typical populations and the sort of error that you could think about. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
How do you deal with the health states that are valued less than 0? In other words, when you look at the valuation, sometimes there are health states that actually go below 0, and they're not obviously fitting into the 0 to 1. And also, when you look at the valuation, it's also not necessarily a linear relationship, especially at the ends of the valuation. How does that work in this in the models that you've put forward?
So the utilities that are less than 1, we have the TTO will give like up to -1. So traditionally we just use the negative value.
Okay.
In terms of the association, if you can try nonlinear models, but they tend not to help too much. Like the other instruments like the WHOI use a multiplicative model, and you can put some sense together around that. which traditionally just the EQ5D has used, but I'm not sure whether it fits better or not. I know what they have found does fit better is a multiplicative model where you look at level multiplied by dimension, and that considers a little bit better, but it still won't solve this issue.
Kind of a similar question. How do you get close to anything? And I'm probably thinking in more traditional terms than you're leading us to here, but how do you, in the absence of anything that looks like a gold standard in this sort of work, how do you evaluate rather than just saying, okay, measured this way, the uncertainty principle is X, measured this way, it's Y, and it's not too far apart. I mean, is that the end of the evaluation of your program?
Are you asking in terms of like the way we measure utilities themselves, or the uncertainty associated with it?
The uncertainty.
So I think these methods do a pretty good job of characterizing the uncertainty itself. I think, like the probabilistic uncertainty. I think that your point about the gold standard, there's just so much mess in the way these things are measured anyway that the kettle of fish we haven't touched, but it's still worth it. I don't know whether that answers your question, or whether, Kelvin, you have any thoughts on that?
I think I heard the question. Is it related to, is there a gold standard for capturing uncertainty or measuring uncertainty?
Yeah,
maybe I missed the question.
that would be the first question. Is there such a thing in this program of study as a gold standard? Yeah. Going back into history, even if it was an unacceptable one, for reasons that you can perhaps help to demonstrate that.
Historically, it's been to ignore it, and that's been like the gold standard.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so I wanted to ask a kettle of fish question. You said that you hadn't really thought so much about all of the other maths, and I just wonder, I mean, given that the way in which health states are designed and constructed, the various tariffs, multi-attribute versus imputed method, sources of error associated with imputations as opposed to the general population. I mean, these are, to my mind, sources of error that are orders of magnitude larger than the kind of error that you're dealing with. Am I off the mark here? Like, are there approaches for integrating all of the potential sources of error in utility estimation, rather than what you've done is beautiful, but it's quite narrow and it ignores like really a lot of uncertainty associated in estimating utility values. I mean, so it's along the lines of what Charles was asking, but I mean, there are like 6 or 7 categories of error and uncertainty. The whole thing.
Do you have to evacuate truly?
No, attention please. Code red, all clear. Code red, all clear. Code red, all clear.
So, I mean, it's interesting that I think if you look, say, like just to pick one example, the patient versus the public utilities. I'm not sure that's actually an order of magnitude larger than the uncertainty that we're dealing with here, because it's like what we're seeing here is pretty large. But I take your point that, and the whole field is such a mess, and I'm not really sure that it's kind of like we need to do this, but we don't know how to do it. I think so. This plugs quite easily into a probabilistic sensitivity analysis. So my global answer is sensitivity analysis. But the other forms of uncertainty don't plug as easily into a probabilistic sensitivity analysis. It would have to be patient versus general public, or this scale versus this scale. Unless Kelvin has some profound insights on this.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think maybe the way I will look at it is perhaps what's done here is at least one step a little bit forward to account for some of the uncertainties that's not previously acknowledged or captured, and I think at least that will hopefully lead to a little bit better characterization of uncertainty. Admittedly, I'm not really getting a good sense about the relative contribution of the degree of uncertainty from different sources, and I think that's certainly. I think individually we may have different feelings about how large it is relative to the others, and so probably, but certainly, for all those different sources of uncertainty, if we can, have better methods to account for them, that would be great. I'm not sure if there's one single easy solution to account for all of them. Though. Yeah.
Okay, I think we are out of time. So thank you very, very much for coming, and thanks for the